Okay, so the next data set that we have here is something we call trackers. And this definition was something that we initially came up with, but we're increasingly seeing this in reporting today, especially around services that are maybe tracking users as they browse web pages and potentially invading their privacy. And so trackers are essentially unique pieces of information commonly associated with analytical services or social media services that are going to be embedded within a web page and its content. And so commonly what we would say that, what a lot of the trackers that are fairly well known to people are things like Google Tag Manager, Google Analytics, Twitter IDs, Google, GitHub IDs, New Relic.
Clicky ID.
Yeah, Clicky Mixpanel. Anytime you have some sort of marketing-based content or tracking-based software, we're going to essentially have a tracker for it, be able to extract that out. But with this data set, what's particularly interesting is that in order to get it, you have to have crawled the web page. And it's either you've viewed the source and you got the response body, or you actually constructed the application completely by rendering the full page dynamically. And we're able to extract these items out. So looking at the trackers associated with www.PassiveTotal.org, we can see here that we have a couple of Twitter IDs, some GitHub IDs, Google Analytics IDs, and Google Tag Manager. Now, what's particularly interesting is that PassiveTotal.org uses Google Analytics to track the engagement on our webpage. And what we're given is a unique multi-digit code that essentially tracks the activity for our properties. And if we want to segment out our properties, we can do so by cutting a new version of that code, as we can see indicated in some of the examples we have here. Now, what's interesting is that these are pretty unique. They're unique to the customer. And we're able to leverage that from an analytical perspective because we have a database of them, and we have a number of times of the first time we saw it, the last time we saw it. And so what I like to use trackers for is the ability to, one, identify if there's a web page that RiskIQ has crawled associated with what I'm looking at. Two, what technologies or what tracking codes are present on this web page? Are they deploying, a whole bunch of different services and all these different libraries? Or is it just a couple of them? Or is it none at all?
Another cool thing that I've seen cookies, the trackers used for is looking at your own infrastructure, because sometimes when somebody does a phishing site, they'll copy your website.
Yeah.
And they'll copy everything, including your own trackers. So now your trackers will be on their site, and you can pivot off of your own codes to see relationships that you weren't aware of.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that actors might be sophisticated enough to copy your web page and replace out the form and set up a command and control infrastructure, but they're probably not thinking about that Google Analytics ID or that social media account that was buried in there, and our ability to connect those two dots. To me, that's one of the common ways in which we can pivot on top of this data and really begin to understand some of the relationships. And what I particularly find useful is something like you just said. If I'm a new analyst and I want to figure out, maybe what a good example of malicious could be, we could punch in PayPal.com, go to trackers, filter it down to Google Analytics IDs, and start exploring that, because chances are pretty high, PayPal being a heavily phished brand, we're going to find some typo squatted and phishing websites right away. And so when it comes to trackers, what we want to look for here, again, is the time. How often are these trackers coming up? Is it a whole bunch of trackers all at once? Are they changing frequently? Is there any unique trackers inside of the page or interesting components?
Sometimes we've seen that a tracker might only be available for a very short period of time.
Yeah.
And that might be an indicator of something potentially you need to look at because it was only up for a couple days or a day or so.
Yeah, it could indicate that maybe the web server was briefly compromised, or that attackers were trying out a new technique to see if anyone would notice that the web page was changed. So it's certainly an interesting avenue. And what I particularly love about trackers is the fact that we retain all of this crawl information, and the way in which we're extracting these trackers out is a number of complex rules. Sometimes regular expressions, sometimes pattern matching, sometimes automatically derived based on like the data science techniques that we have. But what I love most about it is, in the event that we find a tracker that is really useful that we don't have any rules for, we can write a rule and then apply it back to all the information that we have and instantly gain an understanding of how widespread the use of that tracker is, or help us kind of really open up an investigation. So trackers are something that are always evolving. They're always changing. And they're definitely an interesting data set to keep your eyes on.